Okay, this is our third and final video in the assessment series. The place where we left off was talking about these two distinctions within classroom assessment, formative and summative assessment, and formal and informal assessment. And so now I'm going to ask you to think about all of these dimensions at the same time. And before we left off, we wanted to talk about examples of formal formative assessment, informal formative assessment, formal summative assessment, and maybe informal summative assessment. And so hopefully you came up with examples on your own. I'm going to give you three types of assessment and ask you to classify them as formal or informal, formative, or summative. So let's do a unit test, a low point quiz, very low point, and using think, pair, share, where I as a teacher am walking around and observing what different pairs are sharing. So for each of these three, decide whether they're formal or informal, formative, or summative assessment. And I'll give you a minute to do that. You can pause the video. And so let me go through each of these with you along with the reasoning. And so let's work from the first one. So a unit test would be a form of formal summative assessment. How do I know? A unit test happens at the end of instruction and it's high stakes, which means it has a high point value. So that means it's a type of summative rather than formative assessment. And everybody is getting the same test and I'm getting the same data on everybody. So same assessment and everybody gets it. So I know that it's formal. So I'm getting same data, all participants, which is what we talked about, all students, I should say, rather than participants, and we talked about that as the definition of formal assessment, and because I'm giving the same unit test to all of my students, I know that that's formal, so formal summative assessment. A low point quiz, so it's low stakes, not very many points, doesn't cover much content, and it happens during the course of instruction, so I know that it's formative. And then my question is it formal or is it informal? Well, I'm giving the same quiz to all of my students. So in this case, my quiz would be an example of formal formative assessment, which means my think, pair, share would be a form of informal formative assessment. Why? So it's happening during instruction, so I know that it's formative and it's low stakes. There's no points associated with it. At the same time, I'm not collecting the same data on all my students. So I'm not going to have time to systematically go to each group and observe what they're saying. And different groups may be talking about different things. And so when we talk about informal assessment, we mean assessment that is not systematic, that is not deliberate in the way that formal assessment is. And so think, pair, share would be an example of that. And so now I'm going to ask you about an example you have of informal summative assessment, this box over here. And so hopefully as you were coming up with examples, you found it pretty hard to come up with informal summative assessment. And that's because we don't really have informal summative assessment. And you can pause here and try to explain to yourself why that's the case. But if you think about it, it makes sense. When we're talking about summative assessment, we're talking about something that has a high point value and it summarizes instruction. So it's a big deal. It summarizes all of the learning that students would have had within a unit. And so you would never want that to be informal. You would never want that to be non-systematic, not planned. So think about if in this class, as kind of a final assignment, I asked Brianna to write a paper and I asked Chelsea to do a project and I asked Brittany to do a presentation and I asked Jeremy to do nothing at all. So if I was collecting different data from all of you, if I was doing it kind of informally, that would probably be really frustrating for you as a student, right? That would feel really unfair. So we don't typically do informal summative assessment because if I'm giving you a summative assessment, then I'm definitely planning it. It's going to have a high point value. I'm thinking about it in a pretty purposeful way. And so in that case, summative assessment is always going to be formal. So those of you who were thinking about, well, what's the similarity between formal and informal assessment? Well, the similarity should be pretty clear here, right? Formative assessment can be formal or it can be informal. Whereas when we're talking about summative assessment, that's always going to be formal. Okay. So with that in mind, the last thing that I'm going to ask you to do is thinking about these three types of assessment. So formal, formative, formal summative, and informal formative. think about, for each of these boxes, identify two purposes of assessment. And what I mean by that is what kind of information it would give you as a teacher. And so pause here and see if you can identify two purposes belonging to each of these boxes. And so I'll go through a couple of these with you in thinking about purpose. So when I'm talking about summative assessment, of course, I'm talking about summarizing learning. So thinking about how well my students learned a pretty big chunk of information. Summative assessment, because it's formal, because it's giving me data on all of my students, also allows me to compare student performance. And that's true of formative assessment as well, because, or rather formal formative assessment. On a formative level, if students all take a quiz or students all compare a homework assignment, I can compare how they're doing. But comparison tends to not be the focus with formative assessment because students are still going to be developing skills to different extents. So really, when I want to compare student learning, I would be thinking about comparison more for summative assessment because that's after all of the students have had an opportunity to master a unit. With formative assessment, I would be maybe less concerned about comparing students to one another, but more concerned with monitoring progress. So what that means is because, as we talked about, formative assessment happens more frequently throughout the course of instruction, I would be interested in figuring out how are my students developing their skills, or how are my students progressively understanding content as we move through a unit. So formative assessment would help me be able as a teacher to monitor change as we go through lesson by lesson. When we talk about informal formative assessment, what is the purpose of something like think, pair, share, or asking students questions? And a lot of the time, it's to guide my instruction minute and really kind of on a very dynamic level. So kind of on a minute by minute. So right now I'm explaining to you guys formal versus informal assessment. If we were in class, I would say, okay, Brittany, would you tell me one difference between formal and informal assessment? And so that would be an informal form of formative assessment because it's happening during instruction and I'm just asking Brittany and I wasn't really purposefully planning that question. But it would help me know right here in this moment, okay, do I think the class is generally getting it? And so it helps me guide my instruction in a very dynamic way. So moment by moment, do I feel like the class is with me? And it helps me gauge class level learning. So is generally my class with me? And if I'm thinking about asking a few people questions, or I'm walking around to a few groups, and I'm doing informal assessment, so it's not systematic, which means I'm not going to get data from everybody, then it might be really smart of me to go to a high-performing group and a low-performing group to see kind of, okay, well, what is the range of how with me the class is, so to be able to sample. Formative assessment, all types of formative assessment, of course, gives me information on individual level performance. And it helps me plan instruction. And so both types, both formal and informal formative assessment, really guide the instruction that I do day to day. But when I'm talking about informal assessment, I'm really thinking about it kind of minute by minute, right? During the course of class. Informal assessment lets me know kind of how am I doing, is the class with me. Formal assessment tends to be something like homework or a quiz, which helps me plan instruction for the next day or what we're going to be talking about kind of within the week. But it's not necessarily as dynamic unit from minute to minute because, of course, it takes time to score and interpret those responses. Summative assessment helps me evaluate my instruction, but more at the unit level. So kind of how well did the students get the unit overall. But it doesn't let me evaluate my instruction day to day or minute by minute the same way that formative assessment would. And so these are the kinds of goals that I would be thinking about when I'm thinking about each of these forms of assessment. And so that kind of concludes the content that I wanted to cover. So the things that we talked about were purposes for assessment, why we assess students. There's an important question of distinguishing measurement and evaluation as components of assessment. Distinguishing classroom and standardized assessment. And within classroom assessment, thinking about the types of classroom assessment. So this kind of reminds me of the tree that we built with long-term knowledge. I'm sorry, with long-term memory, but we can think about classroom assessment as the same kind of umbrella term. So we have classroom assessment at the top, and we can distinguish that from standardized assessment. Within classroom assessment, let me bullet it, we can talk about formal versus informal. And when we talk about, well, let me say formative versus summative, since that's what we talked about first. And within formative assessment, we can talk about assessment being formal versus informal. Formal. Whereas when we talk about summative assessment, it's always going to be formal. And so for any kind of assessment that we talk about, so for example, using an exit ticket, then I will be able to say that an exit ticket is an informal, formative form of classroom assessment versus a test, which would be a formal, summative form of classroom assessment. And so as a final type of review, what I'm going to ask you to do is for each of these characteristics, decide right now if it pertains to formative assessment, summative assessment, or both. And you can pause the video right here, but I'll go through it with you right now. And we'll probably pick up right here when we come in on Tuesday. Concludes a unit has to do with summative assessment. So again, we talked about it as summarizing instruction or happening at the end. Used to assess students or collect data on student performance. That would apply to both because, of course, these are both forms of assessment. And when we're talking about assessment, we're talking about collecting data on student learning. It's usually ungraded or low stakes is formative. High stakes or high point value is summative. It's a comprehensive assessment, so covers a lot of content is summative. Used to inform and modify instruction is formative. Used to monitor student learning. So that is formative, and that goes along with why the purpose of formative instruction is to see how students are developing skills. Used to evaluate student learning. And when I'm using the term evaluate here, what I mean is draw a judgment about what students have learned. And that we would think about as an aspect of summative assessment. And administered at partial intervals throughout a unit is, of course, formative assessment. And we talked about there being more and more frequent types of formative assessment. And so with that, I will see all of you on Tuesday. Thanks for your attention.